In the softly lit Providence Municipal Courtroom, where countless stories of ordinary lives unfolded under the compassionate gaze of Judge Frank Caprio, a trembling father stepped forward, his rough hands clasped together as though holding tightly to the last strands of courage he had left. And behind him, the courtroom fell into an attentive silence, the kind that swallowed even the sound of shuffling feet. The man's eyes were sunken from worry, his clothes worn but tidy, and his breath uneven as he tried to steady himself before speaking. For he knew that this moment could change the trajectory of his son's life. And as Judge Caprio peered down from the bench with that signature mixture of warmth and judicial authority, the father began to recount a story that seemed almost too heavy for one man to carry, explaining how his son, Michael, a 21-year-old with a soft heart but a troubled path, had been caught speeding excessively through a residential zone at nearly 2 a.m, an offense that, under normal circumstances, would have warranted a crushing fine or even license suspension. And while the courtroom screens displayed the recorded footage of the police stop, the father's voice wavered as he revealed that this was not merely a case of reckless youth, but the desperate actions of a young man rushing toward a hospital after receiving a phone call that sent him spiraling. For his childhood friend Jacob had overdosed, and Michael, who had battled guilt and helplessness after watching several peers fall into the quicksand of addiction, panicked in a moment of emotional chaos, driving too fast, heart pounding, fear blinding him from better judgment. The father paused to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand, admitting that although he didn't condone his son's dangerous driving, he wanted the court to understand the pain and confusion that had consumed him, because Michael had been working so hard to rebuild his life, working 2 jobs, attending community college, avoiding the bad influences that once lurked around every corner of their neighborhood. And when the call about Jacob came in, something in him broke, something tied to years of struggling to stay afloat when everyone around him seemed to drown. And so he made a terrible decision, but one made from fear, not defiance. The courtroom listened with heavy hearts as the father described how Michael had always carried the burden of his younger sister's death, a tragedy that had shattered the family years earlier when she succumbed to an aggressive cancer at age 9, leaving Michael with a profound sense of responsibility to protect those he loved, and how losing Jacob, one of the few friends who had stood by him during his darkest days, would have felt like losing his sister all over again. So when he sped through the quiet streets that night, the father said, he wasn't thinking like a reckless driver, but like a scared child, running toward someone he feared he was already too late to save. The courtroom air tightened as the father's words spilled into confessions he had never intended to voice publicly, admitting that he blamed himself for not being able to provide a safer environment for his family, for working too many late shifts that kept him away from home while his son navigated adolescence without the guidance he needed. And he whispered that he feared Michael's mistakes were reflections of his own failures, a sentiment that made several spectators lower their eyes, acknowledging the universal ache of a parent desperate to rewrite the past. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, hands folded, his expression soft and contemplative, as he asked the father what outcome he hoped the court would offer. And the father, swallowing hard, said he wasn't asking for the charges to disappear, only that Michael not be swallowed by a system that didn't always see the heart behind a mistake, that the court show him mercy so he could continue the fragile progress he had made toward building a better life. Then, as if pulled by an unseen thread, Michael himself rose from the back row, where he had been sitting with his head bowed, and approached the bench, his face streaked with the tracks of tears he had fought to contain, and in a soft, hoarse voice, he addressed the judge directly, saying he understood the seriousness of his actions, that he was willing to accept responsibility, but he wanted the judge to know that he never meant to put anyone at risk, that he simply acted in panic because Jacob had been like a brother to him, someone who had shared secrets, dreams, and grief that bonded them through the storms of childhood and adolescence. Michael recounted how he and Jacob used to sit on the curb outside their apartment building, imagining lives far better than the ones they lived, vowing they'd stick together no matter what. But when Jacob fell into addiction, Michael had tried desperately to pull him out, only to watch him slip further away. And when the phone call came that night, Jacob gasping for breath, slurring his words, saying he'd messed up. Michael's mind collapsed under the weight of fear, and the only thought he had was to get to him as fast as possible, even if it meant making a reckless choice. The judge listened attentively, occasionally glancing at the police footage again, noting how Michael immediately explained the situation to the officer that night, voice trembling with shock and dread, and how he had complied fully once pulled over, displaying none of the defiance or hostility common in similar cases. After a few moments of reflective silence, Judge Caprio began to speak, his tone gentle, yet weighted with the responsibility of the decision ahead, acknowledging that life often placed people, especially young people, into impossible situations where emotional intensity clouded better judgment. And he said that while laws existed to protect the public, the court also had a duty to consider context, humanity, and intention, because justice was not a rigid blade, but a careful balance. He talked about the countless cases he had seen over the years, each one a reminder that behind every violation stood a person with a story, a family, a struggle. And he told Michael that he saw in him not a criminal, but a young man overwhelmed by grief and fear, someone who needed guidance and accountability, but also compassion. The courtroom remained utterly still as the judge's voice rose with emotional sincerity, explaining that the tragic loss of so many young lives to drugs was a community wound, one that required collective empathy and understanding. And he told Michael that his instinct to save a friend, though executed recklessly, spoke to a heart capable of great loyalty and love, qualities the world desperately needed. After taking a deep breath, Judge Caprio announced his decision. The speeding fine would be reduced to a symbolic amount, far below the standard penalty, and the license suspension that typically accompanied such a violation would be waived entirely. But in exchange, Michael would be required to participate in a community outreach program focused on addiction awareness so he could channel his pain into helping others avoid the same fate as Jacob. And as he delivered this ruling, the judge told Michael that he hoped the experience would not only keep him on the right path, but transform his grief into purpose. The father broke down in sobs of relief, covering his face as the weight lifted from his shoulders. And several spectators wiped their eyes, moved not only by the judge's mercy, but by the raw vulnerability of a family trying to heal. Judge Caprio then addressed the father directly, assuring him that he was not a failure, that raising children in a world full of hardship was a heroic task, and that his son's presence in court, taking responsibility with honesty, was a testament to the love and values he had instilled, even when circumstances made life unbearably difficult. The father nodded through tears, overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. And Michael, voice cracking, thanked the judge repeatedly, promising to honor the second chance he had been given. As they turned to leave, Judge Caprio added softly that life was not measured by the mistakes one make, but the courage one showed in rising after them, words that echoed through the courtroom like a quiet blessing. Outside, as Michael and his father stepped into the sunlight, the young man felt for the first time in years that he wasn't defined by his failures or fears, but the love he carried and the opportunity he had to rebuild. And the father, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, whispered that no matter how hard things became, they would face them together, because family was the anchor that kept them from drifting into the darkness. The courtroom doors closed behind them, but the impact of that emotional morning lingered in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it, a reminder that justice, when intertwined with compassion, had the power not only to correct, but to heal. And Judge Caprio, returning to his bench for the next case, carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his decision had done more than resolve a violation. It had offered a young man and his father a chance to step into a future no longer defined by sorrow, but by hope. And in the days that followed, as the footage of the hearing circulated online, viewers around the world found themselves moved to tears by the sincerity, humility, and unwavering humanity displayed in that small courtroom, proving once again that even in the simplest municipal cases, the most profound stories of struggle, redemption, and compassion could emerge to touch the world in ways no one expected. In the days that followed the emotional hearing, Michael found himself replaying every moment inside Judge Caprio's courtroom, the trembling of his father's voice, the weight of the judge's compassionate gaze, and the soft murmurs of strangers wiping away tears. And as he walked home that evening with a sense of hope he had not felt in years, he realized that the judge's decision had not merely spared him from legal consequences. It had carved open a path toward redemption that he felt compelled to honor with every breath he took. Yet even as he resolved to change, an invisible heaviness lingered in his chest, one tied not just to Jacob's overdose, but to the unspoken fears and memories that stalked him through every quiet moment. And in the stillness of night, when the city lights cast thin streaks through his bedroom window, he wondered whether forgiveness, from the court, from his father, or even from himself, was something he had truly earned, or something he still needed to fight for. Meanwhile, Judge Caprio, who had returned to his daily schedule of hearings, found his mind drifting back to the father and son whose vulnerability had left a subtle imprint on him. For though he had presided over thousands of cases involving hardship, desperation, and redemption, there was something about Michael's story, perhaps the rawness of the father's plea, perhaps the young man's trembling sincerity, that reminded him of the fragile balance between justice and mercy. And he hoped quietly that his decision would be the catalyst for something good, rather than a temporary reprieve from consequence. As Michael began his assigned community outreach for addiction awareness, his first day was a whirlwind of unfamiliar faces, stories, and emotions, and he found himself standing in a small community center surrounded by posters warning about the dangers of opioids, while volunteers in bright T-shirts warmly welcomed him without judgment, asking him to sit in on a group session where recovering addicts shared their journeys, their relapses, their triumphs, and their heartbreaks. And as he listened, something inside him shifted, something that made his chest tighten not with fear, but with deep empathy, because hearing the trembling voices of men and women who spoke of losing everything, homes, jobs, children, marriages, reminded him of what Jacob had been fighting and how the world often saw addicts only as statistics or criminals, never understanding the years of pain that dragged them into the shadows. During one session, a middle-aged mother with shaky hands and hollow eyes described watching her own son spiral into addiction, her guilt echoing the words Michael's father had spoken in the courtroom. And Michael felt tears sting his eyes as he realized the universality of suffering, how addiction was not a single person's failure, but a storm that pulled entire families into its fury. After the session, a counselor approached him, asking about his community service requirement. And when Michael explained his story, the overdose call, the reckless driving, the courtroom, Judge Caprio's mercy, the counselor placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and told him that sometimes the greatest advocates were those who arrived not out of choice, but circumstance, because their wounds made their words more real to those who needed to hear them. Moved by the experience, Michael offered to stay longer than his assigned hours, and over the next few weeks, he immersed himself in workshops, outreach calls, school programs, and late-night meetings where people clung to hope with trembling fingers. And he found himself speaking publicly for the first time about Jacob, about panic, about guilt, and about how one reckless decision had nearly closed the door on his future. And to his surprise, people listened, not out of pity, but because his honesty mirrored their own fears and losses. His father, watching all this from the sidelines, felt a swell of pride he had not experienced since Michael was a child, taking his first steps. And though their relationship had always carried the unspoken weight of mistakes and regrets, the outreach program seemed to rebuild something between them, a bridge that had eroded over years of grief, poverty, and silent disappointment. And every evening when Michael returned home exhausted but lighter, the father would prepare dinner, asking cautiously how the day had gone, and Michael, once quiet, withdrawn, and ashamed, began to share stories of the people he had met, the strength he saw in them, and the way he felt himself changing in ways he couldn't fully explain. Meanwhile, the story of Michael's courtroom moments had spread across social media, garnering thousands of comments from people who were moved by Judge Caprio's compassion and the father's emotional plea. And though the attention embarrassed Michael, it also made him realize how deeply the world craved stories of mercy, hope, and second chances. And he hoped he could earn the faith so many strangers seemed to place in him.
Yet amid all this progress, a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Because Jacob, who had survived his overdose thanks to the timely intervention of paramedics, was now battling the aftermath of the incident, oscillating between moments of clarity and spirals of withdrawal. And when Michael visited him in the hospital, Jacob's once bright eyes seemed dimmed, hollowed by regret, pain, and chemical dependency. And he whispered apologies that fractured Michael's heart, insisting that he never wanted to drag Michael down with him, that he never meant to be the reason Michael risked everything. And Michael clasped his trembling hand, promising that they would find a way out together, though deep down he knew the road ahead would be steep and uncertain. After several long conversations with counselors, Michael realized he could not save Jacob on his own, and that perhaps the best thing he could offer was support rather than rescue, boundaries rather than sacrifice, and love rather than enabling. But even understanding this did not soften the ache in his chest when Jacob failed to show up for a scheduled treatment session a week later, prompting calls, messages, and searches fueled by growing panic, until Jacob resurfaced 2 days later, disheveled, ashamed, but alive. And Michael learned a painful lesson about the unpredictable grip of addiction. During one particularly emotional outreach meeting, Michael shared this experience with the group, admitting that he felt torn between loyalty and fear, between hope and despair. And the room listened with the quiet solidarity of people who understood intimately what it meant to love someone struggling against their own demons. And afterward, the counselor commended him for choosing honesty, reminding him that healing was not linear, neither for addicts nor for the people who loved them. One chilly morning, several weeks after his court appearance, Michael received a letter in the mail, official stationery, crisp, the return address stamped with City of Providence. And for a moment, panic surged through him, fearing he had violated some unnoticed part of his community service requirement. But when he opened it, he found a handwritten note from Judge Caprio himself, expressing pride in the steps Michael had taken, affirming that he believed in his potential to become a force of good in the community, and encouraging him to continue channeling his experiences into meaningful action. And as he reread the note several times, his hands trembling slightly, he realized that this simple gesture, this acknowledgement of his growth, felt more valuable than any formal praise he had ever received. Inspired, Michael continued volunteering even after his required hours were completed, and slowly he found himself becoming an unofficial mentor to other young people entering the program, many of whom felt their own mistakes defined them. And he shared with them the truth that he had come to understand, that accountability and compassion were not opposites, but partners, and that redemption was something one earned not through perfection, but through persistence, vulnerability, and the courage to face their own shadow. Meanwhile, the bonds between Michael and his father deepened in subtle ways, beautiful ways, shared cups of morning coffee, quiet conversations about dreams long buried, tentative plans for the future. And though the father still carried the ache of lost years and unspoken guilt, he began to see that perhaps forgiveness was not something granted in a single moment, but something rebuilt slowly, gently, through the steady accumulation of small acts of love. One evening, months after the court hearing, Michael and his father attended a community event where Judge Caprio was invited as a guest speaker. And when the judge spotted them in the crowd, his warm smile conveyed recognition and genuine happiness. And after the event, he approached them, shaking the father's hand firmly and asking Michael how he had been doing. And as Michael explained all the progress he had made, the outreach, the mentorship, the renewed relationship with his father, the judge's eyes softened with unmistakable pride, reminding him that the law had given him a second chance, but he had chosen, day after day, to use it well. Standing under the soft glow of the community center lights, surrounded by people's lives intersected through hardship, healing, and hope, Michael realized the profound truth of the judge's words, that life was not defined by the valley he had stumbled into, but by the mountain he was now climbing, inch by inch, driven not by fear, but by purpose, compassion, and the memory of a courtroom moment that had changed everything. And as he walked home beside his father, feeling the cold night air brush against his cheeks, he understood at last that redemption was not a destination, but a journey. one he was no longer walking alone, one shaped not by the mistakes he had made, but by the man he was becoming, one guided forward by a judge who believed in mercy, a father who believed in him, and a future that for the first time in years he finally believed he deserved.
Months passed, and the rhythm of Michael's life transformed with a steadiness he had never known before, each day weaving a new thread into the tapestry of healing that had begun the moment Judge Caprio offered him a second chance. And as autumn bled into winter, the city of Providence shimmered under frost-tipped mornings and streets lined with soft gold leaves that crackled underfoot, marking the quiet passage of time, while Michael continued his volunteer work with unwavering dedication, standing side by side with recovering addicts and anxious families, learning not only about addiction, but about resilience, faith, and the delicate beauty of broken people choosing, day after day, to rise. Even Jacob, fighting through waves of withdrawal and temptation, began to find his footing in a residential treatment program. And although the road remained treacherous, with setbacks that shook Michael's heart, he learned to anchor himself in patience rather than fear, understanding finally what counselors had been telling him since his first day at the center, that love for someone struggling with addiction could not be measured by one's ability to rescue them, but by one's willingness to stand by them without losing oneself in the process. And it was during one of these colder evenings, while Michael sat on a bench outside the community center sipping a paper cup of black coffee, that he realized he was no longer living in the aftermath of his mistakes, but in the momentum of his growth. Because he was no longer the boy running impulsively through fear, but the young man choosing responsibility even when no one was watching. And this realization filled him with a quiet pride he had never allowed himself to feel before. Meanwhile, his relationship with his father blossomed into something deeper and more honest than either of them had ever expected, built not on unspoken guilt, but on shared understanding. Long conversations, laughter slowly returning to their home, and small rituals like Sunday breakfasts and evening walks that restored pieces of their family that had long been lost. And sometimes, late at night, the father would sit on the worn sofa and watch his son across the room, marveling at how the courtroom moment that had once terrified him had become the turning point that gave both of them back the son and father they had mourned for years. The city itself seemed to embrace Michael's transformation, with people who recognized him from the viral footage occasionally stopping him to say they had been moved by his story, that his vulnerability had given them hope for their own struggles. And while such attention embarrassed him, it also reminded him that his journey was larger than himself, a reminder that when someone rises after falling, the light they create can illuminate paths for others still in the dark. Around this time, the community outreach program invited Michael to speak at a large city event focused on youth rehabilitation and addiction recovery. And though the idea of addressing hundreds of people terrified him, he accepted the invitation because he felt it was time to share his story not as a person seeking forgiveness, but as someone offering truth to those who needed it. And when the evening of the event arrived, he walked onto the stage beneath bright overhead lights, his pulse racing as he scanned the crowd, spotting his father in the front row, eyes shining with pride, and beside him, unexpectedly, Judge Frank Caprio, who had been invited as a special guest and who greeted Michael with a soft nod that felt like a blessing. Taking a deep breath, Michael began to speak, his voice trembling at first, but gaining strength as he shared the full arc of his journey, the loss of his sister that had fractured his childhood, the fear and helplessness that had defined his teenage years, the moment of panic that led him to speed recklessly toward a dying friend, the courtroom plea, the tremor in his father's voice, the judge's compassionate decision, and the long, painful, beautiful process of rebuilding himself through community service and introspection. The audience listened with rapt attention, tears slipping down faces when he spoke about Jacob,
murmurs of empathy rippling through the hall when he described the despair of watching someone he loved waver between life and oblivion, and applause swelling when he spoke about redemption not as a reward, but as a responsibility. And when he finished, the hall erupted into a standing ovation that left Michael overwhelmed, his heart pounding with gratitude. And as he stepped off the stage, Judge Caprio approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder, telling him that he had not merely honored his second chance, he had transformed it into something extraordinary, something that would ripple outwards far beyond anything the judge could have ever imagined on the morning of the hearing. In the weeks that followed, Michael was invited to join the community program in an official capacity as a youth outreach coordinator, a role that allowed him to mentor young people facing the same crossroads he once stood upon. And though the work was emotionally taxing, it filled his days with purpose, giving him a sense of identity that was no longer tied to his past mistakes, but to his present contributions and future aspirations. Jacob, too, continued to improve under structured treatment, and while his progress was uneven and sometimes frustrating, he remained committed to recovery, often telling Michael that knowing someone believed in him had made the impossible feel possible. And slowly, the hollowed look in his eyes faded, replaced by a fragile but genuine hope. Meanwhile, Michael's father, noticing the positive changes in his son and in himself, began attending parental support groups, learning how to navigate grief, guilt, and the overwhelming sense of responsibility that had weighed him down for years. And through these sessions, he discovered that he was not alone, that countless parents carried similar burdens, and his newfound understanding helped him heal in ways he had never thought possible. Months later, on a crisp spring morning, when the air felt new and the world seemed briefly washed clean, Michael received another letter from Judge Caprio, inviting him to speak at the courthouse during a special event honoring community leaders and individuals who had turned their lives around after entering the judicial system. And though Michael felt a flutter of anxiety, he accepted the invitation with gratitude. On the day of the event, he stood once again in the familiar courtroom where everything had changed, the polished wooden benches gleaming under gentle sunlight, the seal of the city shimmering faintly. And as he waited for his turn to speak, a flood of memories washed over him, the trembling in his father's voice, the fear in his own chest, the compassionate steadiness in Judge Caprio's eyes, and he felt tears welling before he could stop them, not of pain now, but of profound gratitude for the grace that he had been shown. When his name was called, he stepped forward, his voice steady as he thanked the judge for seeing in him what he had not been able to see in himself, and for teaching him that justice could heal as deeply as it corrected. And he spoke about how that single moment of mercy had set into motion a series of choices that reshaped the direction of his life and the lives of those he served. As he finished, the hall erupted into a standing ovation that left Michael overwhelmed, his heart pounding with gratitude. And as he stepped off the stage, Judge Caprio approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder, telling him that he had not merely honored his second chance, he had transformed it into something extraordinary, something that would ripple outwards far beyond anything the judge could have ever imagined on the morning of the hearing. Auto-rate and reflect on your performance in terms of clearly articulating words. Afterwards, as he and his father walked out of the art house, the sunlight warm on their faces, the father placed an arm around his son's shoulders and whispered that he had never been prouder. And Michael, feeling the truth of that love in every fiber of his being, realized he no longer carried the weight of his past as a chain, but as a reminder of how far he had come. That evening, the two of them joined Jacob at a small diner not far from the hospital, sharing a simple meal, burgers, fries, laughter, stories. And as they talked about the future with cautious optimism, Michael realized something profound, that life would never be free of pain or uncertainty, but it no longer felt like a storm he was trapped in. Instead, it felt like a journey he was choosing, one shaped by compassion, accountability, community, and second chances. And as the sun dipped below the horizon,